you're in the right place. If you want to hear about Copilot, the continuation of that talk's outside. Excellent. So this is a screenshot of my first ever contribution open source. It was for a Node project back in 2015. I had a problem, and I had no idea how to use GitHub. So what I did is I went onto GitHub's repository, found the person who created the project, and then on their profile there was an email. So I emailed them, and this is that email exchange. I didn't know how to do WebSockets in Node.js back in 2015. They taught me everything I needed to know in one weekend. And the beauty of this is the entire time they were emailing with me on the weekend, they were at a K-pop concert in Thailand specifically. And I had no idea what K-pop was. I didn't know what digital nomads were. But what I loved about this and what I love about open source is it gave me a path to learn, but also it was like free mentorship and sort of unlocking an entire world that I didn't even know about. That's not what this talk about. This talk is about success in open source. My entire career has been a series of asking really stupid questions in open source and getting answers. I think like persistence, and I think I identify as male, I'm over 6 foot, I could walk in a room and get answers, maybe through intimidation or because I have a fun handle. But for that reason, I've learned a lot of stuff on how to interact with open source, and I built this project called OpenSauced to help expand that, share the secret sauce with other folks, if you will. So OpenSauced is the name of the project. I'll have some screenshots of it and some more like Figma designs of what we're going to do later. I don't know if someone wants to close this door I don't know if it's distracting. Also, my handle on the social app, which is formerly known as Twitter, is BWEO. I used to joke I was the Beyonce of GitHub for the longest time. I left GitHub a year ago to work on open source full time, so now I'm the Beyonce of open source. Maybe it's standing room. Cool. And then I didn't mention this, but I worked at GitHub for almost 5 years. So pre-Microsoft, 2018, I joined as first advocate with the title. Early engineers have always been advocates at GitHub, but I joined to put some structure around what developer advocacy was, and we formed the first developer relations team. But the whole goal for this is I always wanted to get involved in open source. 2015, my first contribution. Anybody a fan of Gucci Mane? Yeah, just one. Thank you, Helen. Gucci Mane is the godfather of trap music. So if you mumble rap is like what the kids are listening to these days. SoundCloud rapping. He was like one of the first to do that. And he had this one quote, which is, "If you don't got sauce, then you lost," which is why the name Open Sauce. Because I knew there was like a thing and a way that I could elevate my career, get involved in open source, and that's what the whole brainchild and thing about open source is. So the question I want to answer, well, I want to show, maybe these will be answers, maybe they'll just be more questions for you, what are success metrics? So the one thing I just want to get out of the way is like counting stars on GitHub projects is not success. It's a really good metric to see interest in marketing, but at the end of the day, if you count, like if you have 100,000 stars or you have 50,000 stars, it doesn't matter. I think what matters is how many stars you got yesterday, and like if there's something you could do about that number. Case in point, jQuery is a great project that I learned and grew my entire career on early days. It's got 58,000 stars. It's top 100 on GitHub, but it's in maintenance mode. So that's why. So, and this is jQuery. The one thing that actually when I started looking at all this data, as I was sort of approaching open source and what I was going to do next after GitHub, is if you have more than 1,000 stars, you're top 10%. If you have more than 15,000 stars, you're top 1%. So like once you get to a certain point, like there's a saying that I used to hear all the time about if you have enough lobster, it starts to taste like soap. It's the same thing with stars. Like it really doesn't matter how many stars you have at a certain point. Like you're already there. You're going to get all the sort of free stuff you need from all the hosted AWS clients and clones and stuff like that. So, but I did want to point out the thing about stars that's actually interesting. So there's a VC firm called Runa Capital. They have the Ross Index, which they point to for identifying open source projects that are potentially investable. And the way they look at this is actually stars per week. So if there's like an actual influx of stars in a certain week, that's actually pretty notable. It's actually interesting to look at. It's not as interesting 12 months later unless you're looking back for like historical record. So historical record 6 weeks ago, bun.sh got 10,000 stars in one weekend, and that was mainly because they announced 1.0 at Bun. 13 months prior, in July, they got, I think, about 40,000 stars in roughly a month, and that's because they announced their funding. So there's certain, and I'll show this later in our slides, I'm preempting myself, but there's certain inflection points of like where you see engagement and adoption. It can start with stars, but it can't end with stars. JJ, who's the GP at OSS Capital, specifically investing in open source companies and focuses, he actually tweeted this out not too long ago about like what metrics in order of signal are actually the most important. And I agree mostly with what he puts out there. So not everything he puts out there, this tweet itself. So commit velocity is actually a really good insight into like what's actually happening across the project. Like, is there activity? A lot of times we want to see, I found this cool node package, like should I use it? And does anybody know what do you normally do when you look at a GitHub repo to know if you're going to install it or use it? It's like, there's no real good answer. But I always look at the last commit date. If there's like a commit anytime in the recent near future or past, I'll go ahead and try it out. Maybe not install it into the main production upstream branch. Contributor count's a good number as well to see adoption as well, and I'll get into this in a bit. Clones, downloads, and then stars. Like stars is really good to see like early traction and adoption, but it can't be the be all end all. There's this tool called the GitHub Archive, gharchive.org. It's been around since 2013, put together by GitHub and Google in partnership with BigQuery using that tool. And it's got all event data, well, most event data since roughly like 2014, 2015. So what I'm getting at is this is a really good source of truth for data specifically for GitHub. So if you want to look at what's happening across ecosystem, the archive's a good place to start. And this is a place that we actually started within GitHub as well, or sorry, within OpenSauced. So I'm gonna have a bunch of charts and graphs, but I do want to preface, I actually took out a slide for the base first for time, because I have a lot of time. But there was a quote from Jono Bacon, who, I don't know if Jono was here at this event or not. No, he's actually at the Linux thing next week, KubeCon. What I'm getting at is most people promise insights, but what you really get is charts and graphs. So what I have for the next couple slides are just charts and graphs, but I'll give you insights on top of it. So commit velocity, I just picked a random sampling of projects I was interested to see what commit velocity looks like. So looking at this graph, you could see some projects are not created the same. VS Code has an unfair advantage. It's got over 100 people working on it full time at Microsoft, so the commit velocity is off the charts. So if you want to compare yourself to VS Code, okay, but why? The one thing that we could look at too as well is events over time. So this is like a collection, and this is all from the archive. This is a collection of all data of those projects, but all the events. So there's like these two peaks that are on the right of the chart, the orange line, and that's actually the project I mentioned before, which was Bun. So I mentioned Bun had their funding announcement in July of 2022. They launched their 1.0 just September of this year. So those events are really, really cool to look at, but then what next? What happens after that point? I'll tell you what happens after that point in a second, but the one thing actually I noticed when I was at GitHub for the longest time, there's some clear, like, I was gonna say ceilings, baselines that you can cross. So if you have more than 5 contributors, you tend to get notice of a lot more in all these trending algorithms that are out there that folks are contributing to. The other thing is if you get 100 stars in a day, roughly if it's a new project over 30 stars in a day, you'll start trending. And that's because some algorithms look for new projects alone. And if it's over roughly 35 stars, then you'll go trending. I skipped a couple things. The one thing about open source as well is like there's a lot of good initiatives around early contributors and early adopters or early contributors. And I think Hacktoberfest, which ended yesterday, is a good example of this event. The thing that I used to always ask the question about, because I used to work with DigitalOcean when I was at GitHub, about Hacktoberfest, and they always had questions, and we couldn't solve any of their problems like spam. But like, what next? What happens in November? What happens in December? What happens in March and April? And there's never a really good answer, because like this is not DigitalOcean's main focus. It's like a good event to show some awareness and adoption. And I think we have other projects and sponsors here, like TideLift, who are doing a good job of like getting community and connected maintainers. But my whole thing is I wanted to find out what was the thing after Hacktoberfest. So last year we worked with Hacktoberfest in particular to build this dashboard, which is all contributions in Hacktoberfest for the last 30 days. 30 days being October 1st to 31st. And the thing that we solved, we didn't solve the problem for them, but we were to get some eyes into was spam. Last year, we found that 500,000 repos, 500,000 PRs was the number last year, 1% spam. And this is kind of disingenuous, to be quite honest, because not everyone's reporting spam within their projects. So if you're looking to basically deflate like bad actors and bad interactions in your project, it takes an entire village to start working towards that problem. And I think there's some opportunity for us to fix this as well. So spam's a really good metric to look into, but it's what we do after the fact. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer for spam today. We also started listing up projects to be able to show not so much leaderboards, but to show activity. Because the biggest thing that I talk to a lot of bootcamp grads and a lot of early contributors is like they don't know where to start. They don't know how to make contributions. And I think what we have is a lot of really good silos and a lot of really good OSPOs that all do stuff really good within their environments, but there's not a lot of cross collaboration and knowledge sharing. There is, if you go to like the OSPOCon or the OSS summit or events like this, but I think there needs to be even more to like bring in more folks in the fold to find out what's the best practice and like what's the standard for involving folks in the open source. I spent the last 12 months, 14 months, talking to open source maintainers within the industry. I wanted to actually find out like what was, preempt myself. On our YouTube, we have a podcast called The Secret Sauce. I wanted to find out the secret sauce of like how does open source, how do you sustain it, how do you make it successful? And I reached out to Brendan Burns, who's now SVP of Azure something at Microsoft. But he's actually, what I know him from is he's a co-creator of Kubernetes. And the thing that he told me in this conversation was, the thing that they focused on Kubernetes was they didn't look at specifically, they didn't look at stars. They were looking, because it was open source project at Google, eventually outside of Google, but they looked at issues, because issue shows interest. So if enough people are asking questions and opening up issue, and there's like the barrier is not there for you to open the issue, then they can gauge interest. And then you can do the whole sort of reverse lookup to find out, okay, what companies represent the issues. It's a whole nother science there. But then you see PRs show adoption. So as soon as they saw folks outside of Google making PRs to the Kubernetes repo, now you have an opportunity to say, okay, there's folks who are actually invested and want to see this thing grow and get adopted other places. So it becomes now the CNCF, or special interest group as well, which are specifically within the Kubernetes organization. So going back to the whole cumulative stats, like this is a list of this top PRs by volume. Again, VS Code being number one. It's this unfair advantage. You have full-time staff working on a product that's now ingrained in almost every developer's laptop. Shout out to my Emacs friends who don't use VS Code. But VS Code, I mean, honestly, it's everywhere. But there's a couple other projects that show up on this list. Like number 11, Superbase is actually interesting. They've only been around since 2020. It's a hosted Postgres solution. But because they're open source first, their volume of contributions, because they have an entire engineering team, it shows up in the list. Now, when you're looking at your inner circle, your OSPO, or your inner source group, if you focus on like volume or best practices or agile methodology, like you end up showing on this list. Does it mean that you're the best project ever? Probably not. But there's like good, insightful knowledge that you get from how many of these contributions are inside the organization and how many are outside the organization. And that's the thing actually we're working on right now. And this is something actually really fun that we've been working on. I hope to have like a blog post by December. I think we have enough data, but we're looking at actual confidence of the contribution. So watches in the archive are technically stars. Back in the day when you star a repo, you would watch the repo at the same time. I don't think it's still a thing anymore. But then forks are pretty obvious as well. You fork a repo. And here we're actually looking at some data. This is both for Bun itself. But this is those two different points that I showed before, the 1.0 for Bun and then the funding announcement for Bun. That's their watch score. So you can see that sort of a line on the right chart with the forks of how many people forked the project. But the one thing that you can keep in mind is like 10,000 stars 6 weeks ago for Bun is 131 forks. And then now if you look at that sort of velocity of forks, how many of those are actually contributions that made it into a release? So like when we actually start thinking of how we're engaging community and how we're onboarding folks inside and outside, like the entire life cycle has to be looked at. And that's what we're trying to solve at OpenSauced. So this is a rough calculation of how we're identifying confidence. And the idea there is like we want to also use confidence as a way to find spam. So again, I don't have a solution for spam, but like if we can find the confidence of this person actually making contributions anywhere within Git commits. I didn't actually speak to this, but OpenSauced itself, we actually look at Git commits, so we're agnostic to GitHub. So for that reason, we have just a different lens to look at when we're looking at open source as a whole. We did some explorations the last 3 months with data science, putting up all this GitHub archive data into Snowflake, and then building a sort of sandbox to be able to ask a bunch of these questions. So this project in particular is still Bun. And I just picked on Bun because they had a lot of influx. I just wanted to see what happens after their pivot points or their sort of inflection points. And this is it. Basically, the TLDR is, their bust factor tends to be much higher in between those large announcements. So bust factor being if someone gets on a bus and never returns, the detriment of the project. 13% is pretty good, but for the majority of this, these are all bots. So it's spread out across other folks, but there's a lot of renovation and Autobots that roll out. Sorry, I don't know where I'm at right now. I just made a Transformer joke. No one laughed. But what I'm getting at is like this is a sort of eagle-eyed view on what's happening in the Bun ecosystem and the project. So in reality, there's a bust factor of closer to 80% if you take out all the bots, because the founder and the main maintainer, which is Jared Sumner, is doing the majority of the work in between large announcements. Another chart for pull requests per week, roughly, again, this is like to be able to see what's happening with the ecosystem. If I'm making a decision to adopt Bun into my project, I've got a lot of questions about like sustainability. So I just came out of Steve's talk for like choosing long-term service for Node over in the OpenJS track. And specifically, like you don't do minor versions at Capital One, because if you're gonna have to break a bunch of stuff downstream, like that becomes a huge problem. And I think the same thing with Bun. Like you might have some breaking changes down the road because it's still cutting edge. And I'd have like a lot of questions before you adopt it. Eventually they'll get there, and I think they'll be successful, but just stuff to think about. So for the main talk, I'm just going to show some other charts and graphs with some insights on top of it. But the thing I wanted to actually look at is the bust factor, that contribution distribution. So how many of you actually use GitHub day to day? Are we familiar with GitHub? Yeah, so GitHub and open source, they have like these, and even in private repos, you've got this contribution graphs. And I've always had like problems with this because a lot of it's not intuitive, but this help you out. You could highlight a certain section on the graph and see data just for that section, which is super helpful because a lot of folks will look at like Redis, for example, look at the top contributors of Redis, and the main person who created the thing actually stepped off the project 2 years ago, but he's still #1 contributor. So like, how do you get insights and eyes into what's actually happening in the project? Highlight that little section. But when you do that stuff, you can actually see these sort of blobs to see where contribution distribution looks like. So you can see like Safi Red's got a lot of contributions, Patak, who works on, this is specifically for Vite, that project, but it still doesn't tell you exactly what's happening. So so what I did is built this little charts to be able to identify what contributions go to what blob. And it's been so much more helpful to identify distribution of work. So if someone comes and contributes to OpenSauced, I can identify, okay, you've got some skill set somewhere else. I can say yes or no to your PR. Or if it's like a brand new contribution of like, oh, thanks for your typo fix. We call those typo hunters at OpenSauced. Maybe not today, but maybe like come join our Discord and we can talk about this contribution eventually. So what we've been doing is like we've been actually partnering with maintainers to connect their their GitHub organization to OpenSauced so that we can identify repeat contributors. So the one thing that I actually learned during my time at GitHub is repeat contribution is actually one of the inflection points for success inside of projects. Astro is a project that specifically had a lot of repeat contributors first quarter of 2021, and their success led into them turning into a VC-backed website builder. The other thing is new contributors is actually something that's really interesting. For Next.js, I was actually seeing almost 80% turnover for new contributors. I didn't quite actually dig in the data just yet to find out what type of contributions folks are making, but because their plugin infrastructure is all inside of the one mono repo, I believe that's why they get so many new contributors to replace churn contributors. And that's what the chart is on the right. And this is this is basically a screenshot that was meant to be a GIF showing how we sync the process through GitHub. So as I wind down, I'll show some pretty quick things that more concepts. OpenSauced being the name, Oscar being the metric, which is OpenSauced contributor reputation. We want to identify based on your influence or your contribution within projects within open source, identifying where you are in sort of the repeat to new and bus factor distribution. So the chart on the right is Guilfoyle is basically high throughput distribution, but folks on like the sort of no avatar on the left, maybe not as high impact. So like when we think about how we look at folks contributing, like where do you fall within the Oscar reputation? This is actually still a concept that we're hopefully going to launch. I'm not a PM, but I know from PMs to not put a date on anything, so Q1 of next year. Some other stuff that I'll just scroll through is we actually have been exploring this data and like how do we present it into places that maintainers will actually want to use it. So we built a CLI, which is called the Pizza CLI. And you can get insights on projects to find out if your distribution of repeat and new contributors, as well as alumni or churned. And then we built this thing called the Pizza Show to be able to show off contributors and what contributions they have. It's all like fun little weekend projects we've been building on top of this data. But if you have ideas, it's open source. We'd love for you to chat with you. And this is actually A. Haywood's actually a new contributor to the Redwood project. I spoke at their conference, so these are some slides from their conference to show new contributions from her list. And then we've also been exploring, and this stuff's actually live, the idea of a tree map to see distribution of work. So a lot of times in your organization, you might have folks who contribute here and not really know where the overlap is. So we want to visualize that in a way that makes sense. So the idea is you can see the repos represented with the organization. You see the overlap of where people are contributing together, overlapping in different places. It's been super helpful for test. Turn off. I think it actually ran out of battery. It's like not even on. Duracell. Make another 90s joke. Duracells. All right. I'll power through, and yeah, I don't think you're getting audio from this, so. Yeah, so anyway, we have the tree map to identify and visualize what that is. So the question that you wanted to get answered in the beginning, what is success in open source? Success is the friends we make along the way. So that is actually it. We technically have 3 minutes if anybody has any questions.
How do you integrate with GitHub?
How do we integrate? So today we authenticate only through GitHub, so that's our off service. We plan on expanding to other tools, but like to put it bluntly, without a mic on, like GitHub's a home for open source, so we're focused there. Find me on happy hours of Twitter. Thank you.